The sky that morning over St. Mary Mead was low and undecided, the kind of gray that refuses to rain, but quietly keeps the sun at bay. Miss Marple sat at her window, with her needlework untouched, her tea barely cooled. Her eyes, sharper than most in the village ever guessed, lingered not on her stitch, but on the garden across the lane. Ivy Cottage, long dormant, had a new figure moving through its overgrown flower-beds. A girl, slight, quiet, her sleeves rolled, her hands already dirt-streaked. Miss Marple had seen many new tenants come and go over the years, but this one carried with her a stillness that unsettled even the birds. Her name was Beatrice Holloway, a name unfamiliar to the village, but known to the house in some quiet, unspoken way. She had come after the death of Miss Ada Fanshawe, who had lived alone in the cottage for 3 decades and died without ceremony, leaving behind nothing but a sparse will and a silver mirror wrapped in cloth. Beatrice said she was a distant relation. No one questioned it, not even Florence, who had tended Ada's garden for years. But something about the girl's movements, the way she avoided the front windows, the careful way she walked the cracked paths, as though retracing someone else's steps, caught Miss Marple's attention. That same afternoon, Florence stopped by with a parcel from the vicarage and a story she hadn't meant to tell. She'd gone to clean the sitting room and noticed something odd. The silver mirror Ada had always kept hidden in a drawer was gone. In its place, a faint rectangle of dust and a folded square of paper left behind. "It weren't addressed to no one," Florence whispered, twisting her hands. "Just one line. Said, 'The truth lives where you left her.'" Miss Marple said nothing at first. She only turned her gaze once more to the window, where Beatrice now knelt beneath the old hydrangea bush, fingers brushing aside dead leaves, as if searching for something other than weeds. The girl hadn't been in the village more than a fortnight, yet the garden seemed to know her already, or remember her. That evening, Miss Marple retrieved her walking shawl, made a quiet call to the vicar, and asked after Ada Fanshawe's will. The language, she remembered, had been oddly formal, detached almost, as though written not to leave a legacy, but to close a door. Ada had bequeathed the cottage and contents to the bearer of the hollow name, a phrase so peculiar even the solicitor had paused. But Miss Marple now thought it deliberate. Ada had always been a guarded woman, but never cruel. And this phrasing, sounded like someone trying to say something they weren't allowed to say aloud. When Florence returned the next morning with more linens to launder, she casually mentioned something else. "Funny thing, though," she said, setting down the basket. Beatrice found an old hairbrush buried in the garden, behind the hydrangeas. Looked like it had been left there a long while. Had the initials E.H. carved on the handle. Miss Marple's needle froze mid-stitch. E.H. She remembered Ellen Holloway, Ada's maid from years ago. Quiet, devoted, vanished from parish records in 1932 without a trace. The village never asked questions. In those days, it wasn't polite to pry. But the garden, Miss Marple knew, had a longer memory than people did. As twilight fell, the mirror reappeared, hung not in a drawer or under a cloth, but placed plainly above the hearth. Its surface slightly cracked, the silver faded. Beatrice had mounted it without announcement, as if she knew it belonged there, as if she had been waiting to see what it might reflect. Miss Marple sipped her tea without sugar, eyes narrowing gently. The story, it seemed, had already begun, not loudly, not with a scream or a letter or a knock in the night, but with a garden quietly awakening, and a girl walking paths too familiar for a stranger. Something had returned to Ivy Cottage, and it was time, Miss Marple thought, to follow it back to where it had begun. The morning after the mirror was hung, the village returned to its usual rhythm, slow, deliberate, and deceivingly uneventful. But for Miss Marple, the details that others missed were already gathering like threads in a tapestry. She did not wake early by habit but by nature, and from her chair at the window, she saw something that did not match the weather or the hour. Beatrice, still in her dressing gown, staring into the mirror as if expecting it to answer. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by Florence's kitchen, ostensibly to drop off marmalade. But with quiet curiosity, she asked, "Did Miss Holloway mention what else she found in the garden?" Florence hesitated. She said there was something behind the shed, wrapped in oilskin. "I didn't pry," but it looked like an old photo frame. A photo frame, found near where Ellen Holloway had once kept her laundry lines. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a gentle visit to Ivy Cottage under the pretext of offering a potted primrose. Beatrice invited her in, polite but guarded, and led her into the sitting room, where the hearth glowed faintly, and the mirror watched them both in silence. It was then that Miss Marple saw it. The photograph, now framed and placed just below the mantel. 3 figures. A woman, a man in uniform, and a younger woman with solemn eyes. The man wore a military dog tag, barely visible but unmistakable. The elder woman was Ada, unmistakable even in youth. And the younger woman, not Ada, but certainly of her blood. Beatrice noticed Miss Marple's eyes lingering. "I found it behind the woodshed," she said softly. "It was wrapped like someone meant to protect it, not hide it. Do you know who they are?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She leaned forward, studying the woman on the right. The shape of the jaw, the subtle curve of the brow. It was Ellen Holloway, undoubtedly. And beside her, the soldier with the medal on his chest bore the insignia of the 1917 regiment. "The past," Miss Marple said gently, "has a way of refusing to stay buried when its work isn't finished." When she returned home, she did something she rarely did. She opened her locked drawer of old parish records and personal notes, kept from years when things were spoken of only in whispers. She found Ellen Holloway's employment record. A single line. "Dismissed March 1932. No reason, no address, no follow-up, nothing more. That night, the wind rattled her windows with more insistence than usual. She rose to reboil the kettle and spotted a thin strip of candlelight glowing faintly from Ivy Cottage's window well past midnight. The next day brought a visit from Inspector Crail, responding to a minor break-in reported on the far side of the village. As he sipped tea in Miss Marple's parlor, she brought up Ada's passing, casually, as if sharing an observation. "It strikes me," she said, "how Ada lived so long in a place full of memories, yet never once spoke of family." Crail nodded. "Well, her will was quite vague, wasn't it? Left everything to a girl nobody here remembers." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Some families are not remembered because they were never acknowledged." The real surprise came later that evening when Florence, nervous and out of breath, came to Miss Marple holding a letter. "Miss Holloway asked me to burn this," she whispered, "but I thought you should see it first." It was addressed in Ada's hand. The ink faded but legible. To Beatrice, should she ever come. Inside a single sheet. "My dearest girl, if you're reading this, it means the mirror is no longer hidden. It means you've returned to what was always yours, though the world wouldn't let me say so. You were never unwanted, only unspoken, and for that, I am sorry." Miss Marple folded the letter with slow, deliberate care, then looked out her window once more, toward Ivy Cottage. The mirror reflected light now, not secrets. But secrets, she knew, had a way of living just long enough to be heard, and the past was beginning, softly, to speak. By the next morning, the clouds had gathered in low, slate-colored folds above St. Mary Mead, and the air hung thick with the kind of stillness that precedes rain or revelation. Miss Marple, having read Ada's letter twice more before bed, began her day with a quiet resolve. The past, now roused, would not be settled by sentiment alone. It would require patience, discretion, and the willingness to listen between the silences. At Ivy Cottage, Beatrice had begun unpacking more of the belongings left behind, boxes sealed by Ada herself, dusty with time, but untouched by sentiment. Florence, returning to help tidy the pantry shelves, mentioned one box in particular that had been left in the parlor corner. "She didn't open it right away," Florence whispered to Miss Marple later that afternoon. "Said she had a strange feeling about it, like it wasn't meant to be opened all at once." Miss Marple, visiting with a bundle of fresh lavender tucked beneath her arm, asked gently, "May I have a look?" The box was wooden, narrow, and slightly warped, with the initials AF carved into the underside. When pried open, it released the dry scent of old paper, ink, and something fainter, burnt sugar, or lavender perhaps. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with fading blue ribbon. Each envelope bore no address, Only the initials F.A. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Frances Alcott," she murmured, almost to herself. The first letter Beatrice read aloud. Her voice trembled only slightly. "My dearest Annie, they have told me the child will not be recognized. Not by name, not by law, but in my heart. She is ours, mine and yours. They say the war took too much from us already, but they cannot take her." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her face unreadable. Beatrice's eyes were damp. "Annie is Ada, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Before she was Ada Fanshawe, she was Annie Farley, a name she buried when the child was taken to Ellen Holloway. There was a moment of heavy quiet in the room. The clock ticked gently. Outside, a single crow cut through the clouds. Then Florence, dusting the shelf nearest the hearth, let out a small gasp. "There's something here," she said, pointing to a sliver of wall behind the bookcase. The wallpaper was peeling in a place that didn't quite match the rest of the room. Miss Marple stood and approached, brushing her fingertips along the edge. It was faint, but visible now, a seam. And beneath it, a narrow panel of wood. Together, they pried it open. Inside was a compartment no bigger than a shoebox, lined with linen. Within it lay a faded photograph of a baby wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her face turned just slightly to the side. Underneath the photograph was a birth record, faint, smudged, but legible. Name, unnamed female. Mother, Annie Farley. Beatrice stared at the document as though the breath had left her lungs. "She kept it," she whispered. "All this time." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the young woman's arm. "Ada may not have spoken aloud," she said softly, "but she never stopped watching." As the rain finally began to fall, soft as breath against the windows, Miss Marple remained in that parlor, quietly, respectfully. The air was different now. Not lighter, but clearer. A wall, once built from shame and necessity, had begun to crack, and behind it, the voice of a forgotten woman had started to rise, written in letters, hidden in wallpaper, and carried now in the steady, uncertain hands of her granddaughter. The rain passed by dawn, leaving behind a landscape softened by dew and the lingering perfume of turned soil. At Ivy Cottage, Beatrice rose early, her sleep light and interrupted by dreams she could not fully recall, glimpses of names she'd never spoken, and the weight of eyes watching from behind lace curtains. The discovery of Ada's hidden letters had unspooled something in her, a thread that, once pulled, could not be tucked neatly back into its place. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken to her small desk after breakfast, pen in hand, cross-referencing names from Ada's letters with the quiet corners of village memory. One stood out, Frances Alcott, a soldier, a man who never returned, but not forgotten. Later that morning, Florence arrived in a flustered hush, her boots wet from the orchard path. "I saw someone," she said breathlessly. "Not a stranger. At least, I don't think so. A man in a brown coat. He was walking near the back gate of Ivy Cottage, close to the old pear trees. When I called out, he didn't answer, just turned and vanished toward the lane." Beatrice's brow furrowed. "No one's supposed to be back there. That land was sold off years ago." Miss Marple stood, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "Describe him." "Older. 60 maybe. Tall but stooped. Carried something under his arm. Looked like a ledger or folder." The orchard, once part of Ada's property, had long been overgrown, its fruit trees now gnarled and unkempt. Miss Marple offered no immediate theory. Instead, she requested they walk there together, quietly, and without assumption. The path behind Ivy Cottage had turned muddy with the storm. As they reached the orchard's edge, they found footprints. Not the crisp, defined ones made by rubber soles, but deep, uneven impressions. A man who limped slightly, or favored one side. Beside the old stone bench, something glinted in the grass. Miss Marple bent down and picked it up. It was a brass button, military issue. And beneath the bench, wedged between the stones, was a corner of paper, torn and damp. When unfolded with care, it revealed the top of a page. Chancery Registry, filed record, 1920. Miss Marple's lips drew to a thin line. "Legal filings," she murmured. "Land, trust, or inheritance." They returned to the parlor in quiet procession. Florence made tea. Beatrice held the button in her palm, tracing its worn edge with her thumb. Miss Marple sent a telegram that afternoon. A contact in the city. She didn't share the contents with Beatrice, not yet, but her eyes, when she folded the slip of paper, had changed. Not panicked. Determined. That evening, Beatrice sat before the fire, a blanket around her shoulders, the packet of letters open again on her lap. She read one aloud, not to anyone in the room, but to the air, as though her voice might carry it back to the woman who once wrote it. I cannot walk beside her, not in the light, but I will stand near, always near. She must never know my name, only that I chose silence for her sake. The photograph of the child, still resting on the mantel, seemed to glow softly in the firelight. And outside, in the orchard beyond the kitchen window, a branch shifted, though there was no wind. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her knitting once again in hand, did not look up, but she did say, gently and with certainty, "Some men return not for closure, but for control." And Beatrice, staring into the coals, felt the truth of it settle like frost on her skin. The wind had changed direction by morning, cooler now, brushing against the hedges as though testing whether the village had softened overnight. At Ivy Cottage, Beatrice woke to the sound of soft creaking above her ceiling. It wasn't the groan of beams adjusting to temperature, nor the harmless scratch of nesting birds. It was heavier, measured. Footsteps. Only for a moment. Then silence again. She sat up, heart thudding in that strange rhythm between fear and familiarity. Ivy Cottage had long been a house of echoes. But this was different. Later that day, with Florence sweeping the hearth and Miss Marple visiting for tea, Beatrice mentioned it, quietly, as though naming it too clearly might give it form. "I heard something," she said, pouring hot water over the leaves. "Above me, in the attic." Florence's eyes flicked upward, then back down to her hands. "There's not much up there," she said. "A few trunks. Some old furniture. Miss Ada never let anyone near it." Miss Marple sipped her tea without comment. Then, after a pause, she said, "Sometimes people lock things away not to forget them, but to control how and when they return." With lantern in hand, the three of them climbed the narrow staircase to the attic door, painted over in places, the latch faintly rusted. Beatrice turned the key, unearthed from Ada's old sewing tin, and gently pushed the door open. The attic breathed out dust and memory. Light filtered through a single round window, illuminating trunks covered in linen, boxes labeled in Ada's tidy script, and near the far corner, an armoire with one door slightly ajar. But what drew their eyes first was the desk. It was child-sized, a schoolgirl's desk. Upon it sat a faded notebook, a chipped ink bottle, and a locket. Beatrice stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly. She opened the notebook. Inside, a name written over and over in blocky, uncertain letters. L. Holloway. Not Ellen, as Beatrice had known her foster mother, but Lavinia. And below it a single sentence. "I was told never to say where I came from, so I wrote it down instead." Miss Marple gently took the locket and opened it. Inside were two curls of hair, one auburn, the other nearly silver. A photograph had been removed, but an imprint of its shape still remained. "Hair keeps," she said softly, even when memory frays. From behind one of the trunks, Florence let out a small gasp. She held up a leather satchel, worn but intact. Inside it, folded letters tied with black ribbon, a child's sketchbook, and an envelope bearing a crest none of them recognized. Miss Marple read the first letter aloud. It was not addressed to Ada. It was addressed to Francis Alcott, the same name that had surfaced in the soldier's tag. The handwriting, unmistakably Ada's. "If you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to send it. But she is safe. Her name is Lavinia now. She'll never know of the house in Cornwall. She'll never know your name, but she will carry your quiet." Beatrice sat down, the words hitting her not as revelation, but recognition. The silences of her childhood, the vague answers, the way Ellen Lavinia had always looked away when asked about her beginnings. They made sense now. The attic had not just stored Ada's secrets. It had preserved Lavinia's too. Miss Marple, standing beside the window, Watch the orchard beyond. She was never meant to be hidden forever, she said. Only long enough to survive the storm. That evening, Beatrice lit a candle and returned alone to the attic. She placed the locket back on the desk, left the letters undisturbed, and sat for a long time beside the old-school chair. Outside, in the half-light, a figure passed along the lane. Mr. Lom, the solicitor. Watching, pausing, then walking on. But now, Beatrice was no longer afraid of footsteps in the dark. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with a low, unsettled wind that crawled along the rooflines of St. Mary Mead, rattling shutters and unsettling memories. Inside Ivy Cottage, the fire burned low, and Beatrice stood at the edge of the hearth, staring into the embers. Something had drawn her there, some impulse she couldn't quite name. The attic had offered its truths, but truth, as Miss Marple once said, has a tendency to leave threads hanging. Beatrice knelt, brushing soot from the hearth's edge. A strange curiosity tugged at her, one born not of superstition, but of instinct. Beneath the iron grate, nestled among cold ash and forgotten nails, her fingers closed around something small and metallic. A key, not the sort one used for doors, but older, ornate, with a fleur-de-lis handle and a thin shaft, worn at the teeth. She turned it in her palm. It had not been dropped. It had been placed. The next morning, Beatrice carried the key in her pocket to the vicarage, where Miss Marple was engaged in quiet tea with Reverend Linton. The older woman's gaze flicked to the glint of brass in Beatrice's hand. "From the hearth?" she asked softly. Beatrice nodded. Miss Marple set down her cup and, with a glance that held neither surprise nor satisfaction, only that quiet gravity she reserved for moments that mattered, said, "We may now find what Ada left behind intentionally." By midday, the three women returned to Ivy Cottage. Florence joined them with a lantern and wool gloves. Miss Marple directed their attention not to the attic this time, nor to the study, but to a side cupboard beneath the staircase, long dismissed as a place for boots and raincoats. She had noticed the faint outline of hinges behind the back panel weeks ago, but had said nothing. "Secrets," she explained, "are best approached when they are ready to be opened." The key slid in without resistance. The panel gave way with a hollow sigh, revealing a shallow recess, and within it, a narrow box of polished oak. The lid bore no markings. Inside lay a folded cloth, yellowed with age and edged in delicate needlepoint, and wrapped within it a will, not the will Mr. Lom had presented weeks ago. This was older, dated 3 years earlier, signed by Ada Fanshawe, and witnessed by a woman named L. Holloway. Miss Marple read it aloud in a voice that was both firm and mournful. It left everything, not just the house and possessions, but specific bonds, a small bank account, and a parcel of land near Devon, to one Lavinia Holloway or, failing that, to her daughter, unnamed but described as born of my blood, rightful in silence and love. Beatrice could not speak. The silence that followed was full, but not oppressive. It was a silence that recognized itself, no longer needing to be hidden. But the box held something else, a leather-bound diary. Not Ada's, but Lavinia's. Florence, wide-eyed, opened the first page. The handwriting was precise, gentle. "I was never meant to have a voice," it began, "so I learned to write instead. Ada was my shelter, not my shame. She taught me that love unspoken still holds weight." Miss Marple, turning to Beatrice, laid her hand upon hers. "This," she said quietly, "is the missing bridge, the truth not only preserved, but passed on." But just as Beatrice began to smile, Florence gasped. Tucked at the back of the diary, carefully flattened and hidden between the final pages, was a receipt for medicine, dated just days before Ada's death, signed not by Ada or Florence, but by Mr. Lom. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Now why," she murmured, "would a solicitor have access to heart medicine? Unless—" She stood, suddenly grave. "The truth is never just what's written on paper. Sometimes it's what was tampered with." The wind outside rose, lifting leaves and spirals across the cottage lawn. The hearth had offered a key. Now it was time to ask who had tried to keep it hidden. It was not the signature itself that disturbed Miss Marple. It was the handwriting. The receipt, now laid flat upon her kitchen table under a clean pane of glass, bore the same tight, formal strokes she had once observed on an envelope Mr. Lom had posted from the village station. His legal correspondence, always so carefully penned, matched precisely the name scrawled in the chemist's log, J. Lom. And yet the medicine had not been prescribed for him. It had been filled under Ada Fanshaw's name, on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before her death, and collected without her presence. Miss Marple knew the chemist well, Mr. Hatherley, always precise, always polite, and more importantly, always trusting of any gentleman in a dark coat who said, "I'm collecting on her behalf." Miss Marple, shawl around her shoulders and handbag in hand, walked to the high street. Her steps were calm but determined, as they always were when truth was near but veiled. In the chemist's shop, she waited for the bell above the door to quiet before speaking. "I'm afraid I must trouble you about a matter both delicate and overdue," she began gently. Mr. Hatherley, startled but respectful, listened as she asked about the receipt, the transaction, and whether any medicine had been returned and used. He blinked behind his spectacles. "Why, yes. Now that you mention it, Mr. Lom brought a bottle back 2 weeks after Ada passed. Said it was unopened, unneeded. We keep those returns logged. Let me see." He disappeared briefly into the storeroom and returned with a narrow book, opening it with the reverence of a priest at a funeral. There on the page, Miss Marple saw it instantly. The bottle had indeed been returned, but not the same bottle issued 3 days before Ada's death. The serial numbers didn't match. A substitution. Her breath caught in her throat. It was subtle, a sleight of hand that required only confidence and a knowledge of how records blurred when grief was involved. The bottle returned was not the bottle dispensed, and the bottle dispensed was never used. At least, not by Ada. Miss Marple's eyes grew sharper, her voice lower. "That prescription, Mr. Hatherley, was it for a tonic or a stabilizer?" He read aloud from the file. "Digitalin, to regulate her heart rhythm." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "And if taken improperly, or tampered with?" "It would it could stop a heart entirely." She thanked him, as she always did, with grace and composure. But her mind turned quickly, inwardly, to Ivy Cottage, to Florence's remark that the label on Ada's final bottle looked different. And now this, the receipt, the bottle, the forged return. This was no accident of old age or a gentle slipping away. It had been engineered, calculated, a death quiet enough to pass for nature, and quick enough to avoid scrutiny. By the time Miss Marple returned to Ivy Cottage, the rain had begun again, soft but steady, tapping like questions on the window panes. Beatrice, who had been tending to the corner of the rose bed, met her at the gate with earth-stained gloves and an expression halfway between weariness and hope. Miss Marple gently asked her to come inside. They sat near the hearth, the key and diary still on the table between them, the fire casting shadows that danced like long-dead memories. "Beatrice," she said softly, "I believe your grandmother didn't die because her time had come. I believe someone helped her leave this world too soon, and I believe he did it to keep what he feared might surface." Beatrice didn't speak. She simply stared at the fire, hands in her lap, as Miss Marple laid out the truth, not the full accusation yet, but the trail, the ledger, the will, the tampered medicine, the returned bottle, and a man too eager to tidy up legacies not his own. But why? Beatrice whispered finally. She was kind to him. She trusted him. "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes sorrowful. "But kindness, I'm afraid, is often invisible to a man frightened by consequence. And Mr. Lom had secrets buried far deeper than Ada's." The final piece had not yet fallen into place, but the frame was now visible. Someone had tampered with Ada's heart, not just emotionally, but physically. Someone had chosen silence over scandal, erasure over reckoning. And Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly over her skirt, knew what must come next. Truth was now a visitor at the door, and it would not wait long to be invited in. That evening, the wind rose in St. Mary Mead, not fierce, but persistent, as though something long buried had stirred, and now rustled the edges of quiet things. Ivy Cottage sat still beneath the moonlight, its windows aglow and its secrets, at last, uneasily shifting in their places. Miss Marple had requested that Beatrice remain indoors, that Florence stay close, and that no more drawers be opened without care. But as was often the case with stories on the verge of unraveling, something always slips the stitch. It was Florence, dusting the study and reaching for a misplaced spool of thread, who found the second drawer. Not the one where Ada kept her handkerchiefs or old birth notices, but the lower one, sealed with a rusted latch that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside was a velvet pouch, sealed with an envelope marked only with a single letter F. Miss Marple, summoned quickly, opened it with trembling fingers. Within were several things, all quiet as death and louder than any confession. A man's pocket watch, cracked along its face, a pressed violet, long faded, and 3 letters, each signed, each dated, written by Francis Elcott, the same soldier from the photograph behind the mirror. Miss Marple unfolded the first letter, and the room stilled around her. To my dearest Annie. Not Ada. Annie. Ada had not been her name, not then. She had taken another, it seemed, later in life. But here, in Francis's hand, was the truth of her first self. The letter spoke of war and waiting, of a promise made in secret, of a daughter born not in shame, but in silence. The third letter, dated 1919, read only this. She has your eyes and my temper. I've no right to her, not in this world. But know that I send this with all the love I dare not speak aloud. Keep her safe, Annie, for both of us. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it down beside the pouch. Beatrice, pale but steady, whispered, "So it's true." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "You are not Ada's niece. You are her granddaughter." And there was more. Tucked inside the pouch, beneath the letters, was a faded baptismal record. No parish seal, no formal certificate, just a name, Beatrice Elcott, and scrawled beside it in faint pencil, as though added hastily in hiding Holloway, the name she had grown up with. Ellen Holloway, her caretaker, her mother in all but blood, had carried the child of Ada's daughter. Ada, who had raised neither child nor grandchild, but who had remained near enough to watch in silence, too bound by grief to cross the boundary of confession. And then came the knock. Not frantic, not loud, just steady, as though someone had waited a long time to arrive. It was Inspector Crail, his hat in hand, a question already forming behind his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "we've received a letter from a solicitor in Bath. It seems Mr. Lom left word that he wished to speak. He's admitted something to do with the will and the mirror." Miss Marple did not startle. She simply nodded and said, "The mirror held more than reflection. It held what Mr. Lom feared most, a legacy that contradicted his lies." Beatrice stood, the pouch in her hands, as though it anchored her now. So he knew. Miss Marple's voice was low. He knew there was a child. He knew Ada had once been promised a share of Francis Elcott's estate. He feared that if the truth emerged, everything he had gained, through manipulation, through forgery, would be undone. Crail looked down. "Do you believe he hastened her death?" Miss Marple's answer came without pause. "Yes, but not out of cruelty, out of cowardice. He changed the medicine. He returned the false bottle. He waited, knowing that silence would finish what he could not risk doing openly." Beatrice sat slowly, and the room, once too full of questions, settled, for the first time, into clarity. Miss Marple took the letters, the pocket watch, and the pouch, and placed them inside a wooden box beside the hearth. "The time for hiding is over," she said softly. "The truth deserves a place on the shelf, like anything else that has been loved and lost." Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, at Ivy Cottage, history had shifted, not erased, but restored. The days that followed unfolded not in shock or chaos, but in that slow, deliberate hush that descends upon a village when the truth, long denied, finally breaks the surface. Ivy Cottage, once a place of shadows and locked drawers, now breathed more freely, its windows thrown open to the early spring air. But beneath the bloom of new daffodils and the soft clink of teacups, there remained one thread yet to be fully pulled, a name that had hovered too long without consequence, Mr. Jeffrey Lom. Inspector Crail returned the following morning with news. Lom's been taken into custody, he told Miss Marple, his tone not triumphant but weary. He confessed to altering Ada's prescription, said he did it under pressure, said he never meant to harm her, only to delay her long enough. Miss Marple, seated in her familiar chair with her knitting untouched in her lap, replied without looking up. That's the trouble with secrets. They always outrun the clock. She paused. He was trying to buy time. But time, dear Inspector, cannot be bought, only borrowed. And sometimes it collects interest in ways we do not expect. Later that day, Florence discovered a box buried beneath the loose flagstone in the back garden. It was wrapped in oilskin and smelled faintly of lavender and old tobacco. Inside, a stack of Ada's personal notes, letters never sent, thoughts never spoken aloud. And at the bottom, the final piece, a formal will, unfiled but signed and dated 3 days before Ada's death. It named Beatrice as her sole heir. No mention of Mr. Lom. No mention of any charitable donation, as the earlier will claimed. Only a simple paragraph. For the girl who carries what I could not say, let her carry now what I could not give. This house, this garden, this name, hers fully. Miss Marple handed it to Inspector Crail. He would have destroyed this, she said, had he found it. That was his true motive, not money, but erasure, to make sure Ada's history remained unspoken, because once it was named, it would reach back through time and touch too many things he'd rather left buried. That evening, Miss Marple gathered Beatrice, Florence, and the vicar for tea. The room was quiet, the hearth warm. She read from Ada's letters, not for drama, but for clarity. One read, I could not raise her. I could not name her. But I could watch. I could remember. I could keep something safe, even if only by staying out of the way. Beatrice said nothing at first. She only held the letter in her lap, her hand steady. She watched over me. She said finally, all this time, I thought I was alone. You weren't, Miss Marple replied gently. You were simply loved in silence. The mirror above the fireplace, once hidden away, caught the light again. Its faint crack still visible, but no longer shameful. The photograph beside it had been reframed, Ada, Frances Elcott, and Ellen Holloway, now displayed not in secrecy, but in peace. As the village settled into evening, Miss Marple stepped outside. The garden smelled of damp earth and rebirth. She looked toward the path that led away from Ivy Cottage, where shadows no longer clung quite so tightly to the hedges. And as the wind stirred gently through the ivy, she thought, not of crime, not of guilt, but of healing. Sometimes, she reflected, justice is not delivered in a courtroom, but in the turning of a key, the opening of a locked drawer, and the willingness to let the past finally exhale. Spring settled quietly over St. Mary Mead, not with fanfare, but with a soft persistence, the kind that seeped into windowsills and loosened the cold from old floorboards. Ivy Cottage had changed, though few would say so aloud. It still bore its name etched in the front gate's iron, still wore the same moss along its stones, but the silence had lifted. The kind of silence that doesn't come from solitude, but from shame too long swallowed. And in its place, there was something lighter, something alive. Beatrice Holloway had begun to call it home, though not immediately, and not without hesitation. She stayed not out of inheritance, but instinct, as though the soil itself knew her name long before she did. The garden, overgrown and brittle for years, now bloomed again under her care. Not flawlessly. There were weeds, of course, and a stubborn patch of roses that refused to cooperate. But the earth responded to her. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, it was the other way around. Visitors had returned to the cottage. Florence came each Wednesday, now smiling more easily, her arms full of sugar buns or fresh cuttings from the chapel yard. Mrs. Weatherby offered jam, without being asked. Even the vicar, once so reserved, had taken to lingering over his farewells. There was no longer suspicion in the air, no murmur of scandal, only curiosity softened by community, the kind of curiosity that lingers, not to judge, but to understand. The mirror, once tucked away in fear, now held its place above the hearth, proud but unpretentious. Its hairline crack remained unhidden. Beatrice had chosen not to have it replaced. "It's part of the story," she had said, and Miss Marple had nodded. Some things should remain imperfect, so the truth could continue breathing. The photograph beside it had been carefully reprinted and framed. Ada Fanshawe, young and unguarded, Frances Elcott in uniform, proud and weary, and Ellen Holloway, the girl who gave everything without asking for her name to be remembered. And now they were, not with fanfare, but with dignity. Miss Marple visited often, but spoke little of the case now concluded. She preferred the small things, a biscuit that crumbled just right, the scent of honeysuckle returning to the fence. One afternoon, as sunlight laced the ivy on the eastern wall, she brought a small parcel tied in string. Inside, a rose cutting from her own garden. "Lady Thorne," she said, placing it gently into Beatrice's hand. "Temperamental, yes, but loyal once rooted." Beatrice smiled, soft but certain. "Like Ada, I think." Miss Marple's expression warmed. "Yes, dear, and like you." They planted it together near the cracked stepping stone where Ada had once stood, watering it in silence, neither feeling the need to say what was already known. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and sat beside her lace curtains, her knitting in her lap. Outside, the cottage windows across the lane glowed with lamplight, steady and warm, and in that glow, she saw not an ending, but a restoration. A house once shuttered by fear now breathed with belonging. A name once erased had been written again, not in ink, but in soil and memory. Justice had come, not by verdict or punishment, but by recognition. And that, Miss Marple believed, was sometimes the most important justice of all. Some mysteries are not solved so much as they are seen, finally, with honest eyes. And some lives, fractured, forgotten, folded into drawers, wait patiently, invisibly, to be named and held. As the breeze carried the scent of the new rose through the open windows of Ivy Cottage, the past settled not in sorrow, but in peace. And Miss Marple, with a final glance toward the garden, whispered, "The truth, when tended gently, always blooms."